The Babylonian tradition of the Enuma Elish was a concept central to the Mesopotamian understanding of the cosmos, a universe that did not spring from nothing, but rather emerged from a pre-existing chaotic state. Before there was a heaven or an earth, before the gods themselves were given names and functions, there existed only a formless potential. This primordial reality was conceived as an immense and inert body of water, a featureless expanse without direction or definition. This watery beginning was a direct reflection of the physical world known to the inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia, whose civilization depended on the management of rivers and whose world was bordered by the Great Sea. Their cosmology was therefore not one of creation from a void, but of organization from a chaos. Within this realm of pure potential, two fundamental principles were coexistent. The first was Apsu, the personification of the subterranean ocean of fresh water. This was not merely a character, but the embodiment of the sweet waters that fed the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, that filled the wells, and provided the source of all life in the arid landscape. Apsu represented a masculine generative principle, the deep, unchanging source from which fertility sprang. Existing alongside him and intermingled with him was Tiamat. She was the embodiment of the salt water, the chaotic and formidable sea. In the Babylonian worldview, Tiamat represented the feminine, untamed, and potentially destructive aspect of the primordial state. Their condition was described as an undifferentiated mingling, a time when the sweet waters of Apsu and the saline waters of Tiamat were not separate, but swirled together in a single vast body. This state of being was defined by what it lacked. There was no silt-forming land, no pasture. Not even a reed marsh had yet coalesced. This was a time before the gods had been brought into being, and critically, before any destinies had been decreed. In Mesopotamian thought, the act of naming was synonymous with the act of creation. To be nameless was to be non-existent in any meaningful sense. Therefore, in this silent, formless state, nothing had a name, and thus nothing had a distinct reality or purpose. The universe was dormant, a latent possibility held within the commingling of Apsu and Tiamat. This was not an empty void, but a plenum of watery chaos, containing all the matter and energy that would eventually be used to construct the cosmos. It was a condition of perfect equilibrium, but also of perfect inertia, a profound silence and stillness that held the seeds of all future sound, fury, and creation within its depths, awaiting the first divine stirring that would begin the process of separation and organization. The transition from primordial inertia to a dynamic cosmos was not conceived by the Babylonians as a singular violent event, but as a gradual process of emergence. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. Their understanding of creation was fundamentally generational, initiated by the procreation of the first divine entities within the mingled waters. This initial act of coming into being represents the first imposition of form upon the formless, and the introduction of activity into a previously static reality. The Enuma Elish names these first beings as Lahmu and Lahamu. While their precise nature remains a subject of scholarly discussion, their names are often linguistically linked to concepts of silt and sediment, symbolizing the very first stage of material separation from the undifferentiated liquid chaos. Their formation represents the initial boundary, the first hint of land coalescing from the water, a foundational event in the Mesopotamian environment. Their birth was not described as a grand spectacle, but as a subtle development that nonetheless irrevocably altered the nature of existence. The text emphasizes that ages passed as they grew, introducing the concept of linear time into a previously timeless state. This new generation of gods represented a departure from the passive being of their progenitors. With their existence came the beginning of a divine society and the establishment of lineage, a concept of immense importance in Babylonian culture and politics. The act of these gods being brought forth and given names was a crucial theological detail, signifying their transition from mere potential into actual beings, with a defined nature and the capacity for action. This crucial step established a pattern where existence was tied to identity, and identity was conferred through a name. This progression continued with the birth of Anshar and Kishar from Lahmu and Lahamu. These names translate to whole heaven and whole earth, indicating a further step in cosmic organization. Their existence delineates the horizons, creating a conceptual space for a sky above and an earth below, even before those elements were fully formed. This generational layering demonstrates a sophisticated cosmology, moving from simple matter, silt, to fundamental cosmic structures, horizons. Each new divine birth was a further move away from the original unity, creating complexity and hierarchy. This nascent divine activity constituted the first true disturbance in the quiet equilibrium that had defined the pre-existent state. The silence was now punctuated by the presence of new beings, and their growth and interactions introduced the first vibrations of sound and purpose into the void. The perfect, featureless mingling of Apsu and Tiamat was now compromised, setting in motion an inevitable trajectory toward greater complexity, increased divine activity, and eventual conflict. The process of cosmic ordering in Babylonian thought continued through the mechanism of divine procreation, with each successive generation representing a more defined and complex state of being. The lineage that began with Lamu and Lahamu advanced with the birth of their offspring, Anshar and Kishar. These were not deities of specific phenomena in the manner of later gods, but were instead the embodiment of the most fundamental structures of the universe. Their names are of critical significance, translating from Akkadian as whole sky and whole earth. Their emergence signifies a monumental step in the organization of the formless state, as it represents the first act of cosmic delineation. This was not the creation of the physical heavens and the terrestrial landmass, but rather the establishment of their conceptual boundaries, the celestial and terrestrial horizons. In the flat, alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, the horizon was the most dominant and defining feature of the physical world. It was the great circle that separated the visible from the unknown, the dome of the sky from the plane of the earth. By personifying this fundamental structure as a divine pair, the Babylonian theologians gave it a sacred and foundational role in their cosmology. Anshar and Kishar are the primordial architects who drew the circle of the cosmos, giving it shape and dimension. Their existence established the principle of separation, dividing the undifferentiated whole into the essential duality of an above and a below. This act of cosmic cartography created the necessary framework within which all subsequent acts of creation could take place. Without the establishment of these boundaries, there would be no defined space to place the stars, nor a foundation upon which to build the land. The text of the Enuma Elish notes that Anshar and Kishar surpassed their progenitors in stature, a recurring theme in the epic that establishes a clear progression of power. Each new generation is more potent and more defined than the last, moving the universe further away from its inert origins and closer to the dynamic, hierarchical world of the Babylonian pantheon. Anshar, as the celestial pole and pivot of the heavens, and Kishar, as the corresponding terrestrial foundation, together form the cosmic container. They are the first gods to represent abstract spatial principles, a significant intellectual leap from the purely material nature of their predecessors. Their birth marks the end of the truly formless era and the beginning of a structured, albeit still empty, universe. The stage was now set for the emergence of deities who would not merely define the cosmos, but would begin to rule over specific domains within the grand architecture that Anshar and Kishar had established. Within the cosmic framework established by the horizons, the next stage of divine evolution produced a deity who would personify the sky itself. The lineage continued as Anshar and Kishar gave birth to their son Anu. His emergence marks a critical development in the Mesopotamian cosmogony, moving beyond the establishment of abstract boundaries to the deification of a major component of the physical universe. Anu was not merely a ruler of the sky, he was the sky. His being established the highest celestial firmament, a specific and sacred domain that was seen as the source of all authority. In the theological hierarchy of ancient Mesopotamia, Anu occupied the supreme position. He was the divine patriarch, the king of the gods, and the ultimate arbiter of destiny. While other gods might wield more direct and active power in the world, all legitimate rule, both divine and mortal, was understood to emanate from him. Anu's character, as depicted across numerous cuneiform texts, is one of remote majesty. His dwelling was conceived as being in the highest of the three heavens, a distant and often inaccessible realm from which he presided over the cosmic order. This physical remoteness translated into a passive role in many myths. Anu rarely intervenes directly in the affairs of mortals or even the lesser gods. Instead, his function was to maintain the cosmic balance and to act as the final court of appeal in disputes among the deities. His authority was so absolute that his will, once expressed, was rarely challenged. The text of the Enuma Elish itself notes that his son, Ea, was his equal in wisdom, but it is Anu who holds the ultimate sovereignty. This establishes him as the pinnacle of the early static phase of divine rulers, a figure of supreme but latent power. The birth of Anu solidifies the structure of the nascent universe. Where Anshar represented the abstract concept of the celestial boundary, Anu gave that realm substance and sovereignty. He is the first true king in the divine lineage, and his existence provides the upper cosmos with a distinct character and a ruler. This act of populating the sky with a supreme being was a necessary precursor to all further organization. With the celestial firmament now established and governed, the stage was set for the emergence of deities who would preside over the other distinct realms of creation. Anu's reign represents the perfection of the skyward portion of the cosmos, a stable and ordered domain that stands in contrast to the still chaotic potential of the regions below. His presence completes the upper architecture of the universe, creating a divine royal court, and a source of authority from which all subsequent power would flow. The divine genealogy did not conclude with the establishment of the primary cosmic domains. The process of procreation continued, populating the newly delineated realms with a burgeoning society of deities. This expansion represents a theological shift from a cosmos defined by a few great, remote powers to one teeming with a multitude of divine beings, each possessing specific attributes and functions. These younger gods were not abstract personifications of universal structures, but active agents whose existence introduced an unprecedented level of dynamism into the universe. Their collective energy and ceaseless activity began to fill the primordial space, transforming it from a silent, ordered framework into a vibrant, resonant sphere of divine interaction. This was the birth of the divine community, a pantheon whose internal politics and relationships would drive all subsequent cosmic events. The Enuma Elish describes this new phase with a potent metaphor, a growing, vibrant clamour. This was not merely incidental noise, but the audible manifestation of a universe coming alive. It was the sound of divine wills being exerted, of new powers being tested, and of a complex society establishing its norms and hierarchies. The text states that the divine brethren surged back and forth, an image that conveys constant, energetic, and perhaps unruly motion. This ceaseless activity was the very antithesis of the static, unchanging state embodied by the primordial parents. The youthful energy of these new gods represented the principle of dynamic actuality, a force that was fundamentally incompatible with the quiet potentiality of the original cosmic waters. Their interactions, their governance of their nascent domains, and their very existence created a hubbub that disturbed the very core of the old order. This disturbance was not a superficial annoyance, but a fundamental challenge to the pre-existent state. The primordial reality, represented by the belly of Tiamat, was roiled by this new energetic presence. The universe was no longer a place of silent equilibrium. It had become a crowded and active realm, filled with beings whose nature was to act, to create, and to interact. This establishment of a divine society with its inherent potential for friction and alliance, was a necessary step in the development of the cosmos. The growing clamor was the inevitable consequence of creation itself, the sound of a universe in the process of becoming fully realized. It was this vibrant, chaotic energy that would serve as the direct catalyst for the first great cosmic conflict, forcing a confrontation between the static, older generation and the dynamic, younger gods who were now filling the world with their power. The culmination of this initial phase of divine evolution was the birth of a deity who represented a new and formidable type of power. Anu, the Skyfather, begot a son who would be known in the Akkadian epic as Ea, and in the older Sumerian tradition as Enki. The Enuma Elish gives him the epithet Nu-Dimud, the creator. But his essential character is one of profound and active intelligence. His emergence marks a significant departure from the deities who preceded him. While his ancestors embodied cosmic structures and remote authority, Ea personified the power of intellect, cunning, and practical skill. The text itself is explicit in this distinction, stating that he was of surpassing understanding and immeasurably superior to his divine forefathers. This was not a superiority of raw strength or hierarchical position, but of cognitive ability. With Ea, the principle of strategic wisdom enters the cosmic stage. His domain was the Apsu, the subterranean ocean of fresh water, a realm that in Mesopotamian thought was synonymous with the source of all knowledge and secret lore. Ea was not just the ruler of this domain, he was its master, able to harness its power through magic and incantation. This association made him the patron deity of craftsmen, artisans, and scribes, all professions that required specialized knowledge and technical skill. He was the divine engineer, the master magician, and the ultimate problem solver. Unlike the passive majesty of Anu, Ea's character was defined by his interventionist nature. Across the corpus of Mesopotamian mythology, it is consistently Ea who devises the clever plans, who finds the solutions to impossible dilemmas, and who often acts as a benefactor to the nascent human race, sometimes in defiance of the will of other gods. The birth of this god of profound cunning represents the introduction of the specific power that would prove decisive in the coming conflict. The static, brute force of the primordial generation could not be overcome by a similar force, but it could be outmaneuvered by superior intelligence. Ea's very nature is a foreshadowing of the means by which the younger gods will survive. He is the first of the gods to possess not just being, but a plan. His intelligence is not a passive quality, but an active, creative force, capable of shaping reality through spells, design, and strategic foresight. The Enuma Elish establishes him as the apex of the pre-conflict divine lineage, a being whose intellectual might was so great that he had no equal among his kin. It was this unparalleled wisdom that would allow him to perceive the threat from the older generation and to formulate the first decisive response. The escalating dynamism of the younger gods created a fundamental schism in the fabric of existence, leading to the first premeditated act of divine aggression. The conflict was not born of a simple grievance, but of an ontological incompatibility. Apsu, as the personification of the static and the undifferentiated, found the very nature of the new active deities to be an intolerable corruption of the cosmic state. The Enuma Elish articulates his complaint with precision. Their ways have become loathsome to me. This was not an objection to a specific action, but to their entire mode of being. The constant activity, the establishment of separate domains, and the assertion of individual wills had fundamentally altered the universe, replacing the cherished silence of the primordial state with a purpose-driven clamor. For Apsu, this was not progress. It was a degradation of reality itself. In this cosmic crisis, Apsu turned to his vizier Mumu. The figure of the vizier was a central one in Mesopotamian royal courts, serving as the king's chief advisor, spokesman, and the executor of his will. Mumu's role in the epic is the mythological counterpart to this political reality. He is not an independent actor, but the personification of Apsu's own thought and intention, the logos of the primordial deep. When Apsu confides in Mummu, he is externalizing his own internal resolve. Mummu's counsel to destroy and wreck their ways is therefore not the advice of a subordinate, but the articulation of Apsu's own deepest desire. The plan they formulate is one of cosmic regression, an attempt to annihilate the principle of divine activity and restore the universe to its original, featureless unity. The resolution to act was a pivotal moment. It represents the first instance of a divine strategic plan being formulated in the cosmos. However, unlike the creative and ordering intelligence that would later be displayed by Ea and Marduk, Apsu's plan was entirely reactionary and destructive. His goal was not to build a better order, but to dismantle the emerging one. He sought to lie down in peace once more, a state that could only be achieved by the eradication of the new generation. This decision established the central conflict of the Enuma Elish, the violent and necessary struggle between an older, static principle of being and the new, dynamic force of becoming. The malevolent plan was not merely an act of divine jealousy. It was the inevitable response of an obsolete cosmic order confronting the forces that would ultimately supplant it. This theological drama mirrored the political realities of the ancient Near East, where the establishment of a new dynasty often required the violent overthrow of the old. Apsu's resolve to destroy his offspring was the first shot in a cosmic civil war, a war that would determine the very nature and structure of reality. Upon being presented with the genocidal plan, the primordial mother, Tiamat, exhibited a reaction that stands in stark contrast to the cold resolve of her consort. This moment in the epic introduces a crucial theological complexity, revealing a fundamental division within the older generation of gods. While Apsu represents a principle of being that is fundamentally hostile to change and activity, Tiamat at this stage embodies a more ambivalent position. The text indicates that she too was disturbed by the clamour of the younger gods, sharing Apsu's distress at the loss of primordial quiet. However, her response to the proposed solution was one of immediate and visceral horror. The Enuma Elish describes her as being in a rage and writhing in lonely grief, not in sympathy for Apsu's plight, but in opposition to his violent intent. This reluctance is not rooted in a different strategic assessment, but in her intrinsic nature as the matriarch of the divine lineage. Her horrified question, "How could we destroy what we have brought into being?" is the central ethical statement of this section of the narrative. It establishes a key distinction between the two primordial parents. While Apsu views their offspring as an external and intolerable annoyance, Tiamat still recognizes them as a part of herself, an extension of her own being. This maternal instinct, even in a being of cosmic chaos, introduces a principle of preservation that directly opposes Apsu's desire for annihilation. Her reaction complicates the narrative, preventing it from being a simple story of old versus new. Instead, it becomes a drama of internal conflict within the old order itself. Tiamat's initial position is not one of alliance with the younger gods, but of a conflicted loyalty. She is caught between her allegiance to her consort and her innate connection to her children. This internal struggle is a powerful representation of her chaotic nature. She is at once the source of life and a being of untamed, potentially destructive power. Her unwillingness to participate in Apsu's plan creates a power vacuum and a moral stalemate. It demonstrates that the path to cosmic war was not a unanimous decision by the old guard. This moment of hesitation is critical, as it is her eventual overcoming of this reluctance, spurred by later events, that will transform her from a grieving mother into the monstrous antagonist of the epic. For now, her horror acts as a temporary brake on Apsu's destructive impulse, forcing the conflict to a new stage and requiring the younger gods to find a way to preemptively defend themselves against a threat that their own mother was, for the moment, unwilling to sanction. The stalemate created by Tiamat's reluctance was broken not by negotiation or force, but by the preemptive and decisive action of the god Ea. The narrative of the Enuma Elish pivots at this moment, demonstrating that the survival of the new divine order depended on the strategic application of superior intelligence. The text states that Ea, the all-wise, perceived the plot. This act of perception is itself a demonstration of his divine function. His wisdom is not a passive attribute, but an active faculty that allows him to understand and anticipate threats that are hidden from his kin. While the other younger gods remained either oblivious or paralyzed by the looming danger, Ea took the initiative, embodying the principle that knowledge, when correctly applied, is a form of power more potent than brute strength. His response was not to rally an army or engage in direct physical confrontation, a course of action that would have been futile against the primordial might of Apsu. Instead, Ea employed the primary tool of his divine domain: magic. In Mesopotamian religious thought, magic was not a supernatural violation of natural law, but the sophisticated manipulation of the cosmic forces that underpinned reality. It was a sacred science, and Ea was its ultimate master. He crafted a masterful incantation, a spell of such power that it could affect a being of Apsu's stature. This was not a simple curse, but a complex ritual utterance, a sequence of potent words that restructured the fabric of reality in a localized way. By reciting this spell, Ea did not attack Apsu directly, but imposed a state of profound slumber upon him, effectively neutralizing him as a threat without the need for a direct battle. This act of casting a deep sleep upon his divine ancestor is theologically significant. It is a creative and subtle solution, a demonstration of control rather than mere destruction. Once Apsu was rendered helpless in this magical torpor, Ea proceeded to slay him. This was not a chaotic act of patricide, but a calculated execution, a necessary and almost surgical removal of an existential threat. Following the deed, Ea established his own dwelling upon the corpse of the vanquished god, a powerful symbolic act that signified the supplanting of the old, static order by a new intellectually driven one. This cunning intervention was the first victory for the younger gods, and it was achieved not through a contest of strength, but through the strategic application of wisdom and sacred knowledge. It established Ea as the protector of the new generation and set a precedent for how the forces of order would ultimately triumph over primordial chaos. The aftermath of Apsu's defeat was not merely a victory in a divine conflict, but the foundational event for a new cosmic geography. Ea's decision to establish his dwelling upon the vanquished body of the primordial god was a profound statement of political and theological supremacy. In the ancient Near East, the act of a conqueror building upon the ruins of a defeated enemy's capital was a well-understood symbol of absolute domination and the establishment of a new dynasty. The Enuma Elish projects this terrestrial political reality onto a cosmic scale. By constructing his sacred chamber over the slain Apsu, Ea was not just finding a place to live. He was fundamentally repurposing the very essence of the old order. The primordial deep, once a source of chaotic, reactionary power, was now transformed into the foundation and domain of the god of wisdom. This act created a new cosmic geography. The universe was no longer a simple mingling of waters, but was now structured with a distinct and sacred center, the dwelling of Ea, the Apsu. This term now took on a dual meaning. It was both the name of the defeated god and the name of the subterranean freshwater ocean that Ea now controlled. This realm became the source of all secret knowledge, magic, and creative power, but it was now a controlled, ordered source presided over by the god of intellect. The chaotic potential of the primordial deep was tamed and put into the service of the new divine regime. Ea's chamber, described as the Chamber of Destinies, became the new administrative heart of the cosmos, the place from which the fates were decreed and the universe was managed. This foundation of a new order was a clear assertion of the dominance of the younger gods. Their right to rule was now established not just by their existence, but by their demonstrated ability to overcome and reorganize the forces that had preceded them. Ea's victory was a victory of intellect over brute, inert force, and the new structure of the cosmos reflected this principle. The universe was no longer to be a place of silent, featureless unity, but a complex hierarchical system governed by divine wisdom and purpose. The establishment of Ea's dwelling upon the Apsu was the first and most crucial act of cosmic construction, creating a stable point of order from which all subsequent creation would proceed. It was a definitive statement that the era of primordial chaos was over, and the age of divine administration had begun. The death of Apsu, and the subsequent reordering of the cosmos under Ea's dominion, did not resolve the divine conflict. It merely concluded its first phase. The focus of the narrative now shifts to Tiamat, whose initial conflicted reluctance is transformed by the death of her consort into a focused and implacable rage. This transformation is a pivotal moment in the epic, marking her transition from a passive primordial entity into the active and monstrous antagonist. Her sorrow was not a quiet grief, but a catalyst that awakened her own latent power, curdling her maternal nature into a universe-threatening fury. The text describes other gods, likely members of the older, less defined generation who felt disenfranchised by Ea's new order, coming to her and goading her into action. They function as a mythological chorus of resentment, articulating the grievances of the old guard and fueling Tiamat's desire for retribution. Their incitement was effective because it preyed upon her loss, reframing Apsu's execution not as a necessary act of self-defense by the younger gods, but as an unforgivable crime against the primordial order. This external pressure, combined with her own grief, completed her psychological transformation. The maternal instinct that had previously caused her to recoil from the idea of harming her offspring was now entirely supplanted by a thirst for vengeance. She was no longer the reluctant mother, but the avenging queen of chaos. This shift is theologically crucial. It posits that the most formidable force of destruction is not an external evil, but a corrupted form of creative power. Tiamat, the mother of all, becomes the potential destroyer of all. Her rage was not an uncontrolled outburst, but a calculated call to arms. She began to actively muster the forces of chaos, preparing for a war that would not just punish the younger gods, but dismantle the very cosmic structure that Ea had founded. This was to be a war of annihilation, a direct response to the slaying of her mate. The personal grief of a divine being was thus elevated to a cosmic principle, a force capable of unmaking creation itself. Her fury provided the narrative with its central driving conflict, setting the stage for the elevation of a new champion and the creation of a monstrous army designed to overwhelm the new, intellectually driven order with the raw, untamable power of the primordial sea. The universe, having barely survived its first crisis, was now poised on the brink of a far greater and more destructive confrontation. The escalating threat posed by Tiamat necessitated the emergence of a new divine power, one specifically suited to the task of direct, violent confrontation. The Enuma Elish addresses this narrative and theological need with the birth of Marduk. His conception is described as taking place within the sacred chamber that Ea had established upon the vanquished Apsu, a location of immense symbolic importance. This detail is not incidental. It establishes Marduk's lineage as originating from the very heart of the new ordered cosmos. He is the son of Ea, the god of wisdom, and his consort Damkina, a mother goddess associated with the earth. This parentage endows him with a unique combination of divine attributes. From his father, he inherits a legacy of strategic intelligence, and from his mother, a connection to the foundational elements of the world. He is, in essence, the perfect synthesis of the powers that define the new divine order. The epic's description of Marduk's birth and physical form is designed to leave no doubt as to his destiny. He is portrayed not as an infant, but as a being who is perfect and fully formed from the moment of his creation. The text lavishes praise upon his physical attributes, describing him as the loftiest of the gods, with a form that was perfect and difficult to understand. This is the language of royal propaganda, common in Mesopotamian inscriptions, applied to a divine figure. His birth was not merely a continuation of the divine lineage, but the deliberate creation of a king. This is the central political argument of the Enuma Elish. Marduk was not a usurper who seized power, but a being who was quite literally born to rule. His supremacy was an inherent part of his nature, a fact established at the moment of his conception. His divine nature was further emphasized by his extraordinary physical characteristics, which were designed to signify his supreme capabilities. He was endowed with a double godhead, possessing 4 eyes and 4 ears, a symbolic representation of his omniscience and his ability to perceive all things. This quadripartite form ensured that nothing in the cosmos could escape his notice, establishing him as the ultimate watchman and judge. From his lips, fire blazed when he spoke, a common Mesopotamian motif for divine power and authority. His sheer physical size and majestic bearing surpassed all other gods, making him the natural leader in a pantheon that was about to face a war of survival. The birth of Marduk, therefore, was the pivotal event that provided the younger gods with a champion. He was not just another deity in their expanding family, but the answer to a cosmic crisis, a new type of god whose nature was not defined by the passive stewardship of a cosmic domain, but by the active and absolute exercise of royal power. The depiction of Marduk in the Enuma Elish is not merely a physical description but a complex piece of theological iconography, designed to communicate his unparalleled capabilities and inherent suitability for supreme rule. Ancient Mesopotamian religious texts and art consistently used physical attributes as symbolic representations of a deity's specific powers and domain. In Marduk's case, his form is a carefully constructed argument for his supremacy, a physical manifestation of his divine resume. The text moves beyond simple declarations of his greatness to provide a detailed anatomy of his power, ensuring that his claim to kingship is understood as a matter of intrinsic nature, not of mere ambition. His form was, in essence, the perfect instrument for cosmic governance and warfare. The most striking of his attributes is his quadripartite sensory apparatus. He is described as having 4 eyes and 4 ears. This is a potent symbol of his omniscience. In the context of Mesopotamian kingship, the ideal ruler was one who was aware of all events within his domain, able to dispense justice and respond to threats with perfect information. Marduk's 4 eyes allowed him to see in all directions simultaneously, while his 4 ears enabled him to hear all pleas and plots. This made him the ultimate watchman of the cosmos, a being whose perception was total and inescapable. This was not a feature shared by any other god in the pantheon. It was a unique endowment that established his functional superiority. He was, by his very design, more capable of managing the universe than any of his predecessors or contemporaries. This sensory perfection was complemented by an aura of awesome divine light. The text states that he was cloaked in the radiance of 10 gods, a reference to the Akkadian concept of Melamu. This was not simply light, but a terrifying splendor, a supernatural effulgence that emanated from gods and divinely ordained kings, signifying their power and overwhelming their enemies. For Marduk to possess a Melamu of such unparalleled intensity was to mark him as the most potent being in existence. This radiance was both a mark of his divinity and a weapon, an aura of power so immense that it was inherently intimidating and authoritative. His form was described as perfect in every limb, his stature immense, far surpassing that of his divine ancestors. This physical perfection was the outward sign of his cosmic and political destiny. Every aspect of his being was crafted to demonstrate that he was not just a candidate for leadership, but the inevitable and necessary ruler of the gods. The cosmic conflict was reignited not by Tiamat's grief alone, but by the political machinations of a specific faction of disenfranchised deities. The Enuma Elish identifies these instigators as a group of gods who actively sought out Tiamat, formulating a coherent and persuasive argument for war. This detail reflects a sophisticated political understanding, suggesting that great conflicts are rarely spontaneous, but are often engineered by interested parties who stand to gain from the disruption of the existing order. These divine agitators represent the conservative element of the cosmos, those who were either genealogically closer to the primordial parents or who felt their status and power were diminished by the ascendant authority of Ea and his lineage. Their grievance was not just about the death of Apsu, but about the entire trajectory of the new cosmic administration. Their appeal to Tiamat was a masterpiece of political rhetoric. They did not simply offer condolences. They presented a legal and moral case for retribution. They plotted evil in their hearts, a phrase that in Akkadian literature implies premeditated, strategic planning. They reminded Tiamat of her slain consort, reframing his death not as a consequence of his own malevolent plan, but as an act of unjustifiable aggression. By inciting her, they were attempting a political restoration, seeking to use her primordial power to overthrow the new regime and return to an order in which they held a more privileged position. This divine council of war is a mythological reflection of the courtly intrigues and power struggles that characterized Mesopotamian city-states, where factions of nobles and priests would often conspire to influence or overthrow a ruling monarch. The relentless nature of their urging is a key element. They gave Tiamat no peace, constantly reinforcing her grief and sense of injustice, until it transformed into a focused resolve. This process absolves Tiamat of some of the sole responsibility for the coming war. She is not just a monster acting on pure rage, but a sovereign being influenced by her counselors, a common trope in ancient Near Eastern royal narratives. The grievance of these older gods was therefore the crucial catalyst that turned Tiamat's passive sorrow into an active, organized military campaign. They provided the political will and the strategic impetus, convincing the reluctant Queen of Chaos to finally unleash her full, terrifying power against the children who had so offended the old ways. Their success in this endeavor guaranteed a second, more terrible divine war, one that would pit a fully mobilized force of primordial chaos against the nascent order of the cosmos. The relentless incitement by the resentful older gods proved to be the final catalyst, pushing Tiamat past the point of maternal grief and into a state of active cosmic rebellion. Her transformation was not a mere shift in mood, but a fundamental alteration of her being. The Enuma Elish portrays this as a conscious and deliberate decision, a moment where she fully embraces her chaotic nature to become the champion of the primordial order. The nurturing, life-giving aspect of her being, which had initially caused her to recoil from Apsu's plan, was now systematically suppressed and replaced by a focused, destructive will. This was a theological statement of profound significance. The ultimate source of life in the cosmos willingly became the agent of its potential unmaking. She was no longer a passive victim of circumstance, but the self-appointed general in a war to reverse the process of creation itself. This metamorphosis was immediately made manifest through her actions. She did not simply rage. She began to prepare for war with a terrifying and methodical purpose. The text describes her as fashioning monsters, an act that is a grotesque parody of the creation process. Where the younger god's existence represented a move toward greater order and complexity, Tiamat's creations were beings of pure chaos, designed to violate the natural and divine order. This act of monstrous procreation was her formal declaration of war, a sign that she had fully committed to the path of destruction. It demonstrated that her power was not limited to passive being, but could be actively wielded to generate forces of profound terror and disorder. Her determination to wage a final, decisive war was absolute. The epic states she was unsparing, ready to meet the new gods in a conflict that could have only one outcome: the complete annihilation of one side. This was not to be a limited conflict over a specific grievance, but a total war for the control of reality. By transforming herself into a monstrous force, Tiamat ceased to be merely a character in the cosmic drama and became a personified principle, the principle of chaos actively seeking to reclaim the universe from the principle of order. Her decisions solidified the cosmic battle lines and made a violent confrontation inevitable. The universe, which had been moving on a trajectory of increasing organization, was now threatened with a regression to the formless, silent state that Tiamat now sought to restore through overwhelming and terrifying force. Tiamat's declaration of war was not merely a spoken threat, it was made manifest through a terrifying act of anti-creation. To form her army, she did not rally existing beings, but spawned a new host of monstrous entities, each one a deliberate violation of the natural order. The Enuma Elish provides a specific catalogue of these 11 horrors, a list that served as a powerful piece of mythological iconography for its Babylonian audience. These were not simply fierce animals, but hybrid creatures, beings whose forms combined the attributes of different species in unnatural and terrifying ways. This act of creating composite monsters was a direct assault on the principle of order and separation that the younger gods were attempting to establish. By mingling forms that should remain distinct, Tiamat was tangibly demonstrating her commitment to chaos. The list of her progeny includes beings like the Bashmu, a venomous horned serpent, the Mushushu, a hybrid dragon serpent that would later become the sacred animal of Marduk himself, and the Lamu heroes, hairy wild humanoids. She also brought forth scorpion men, fishmen, and bullmen, creatures that blurred the lines between the human, animal, and divine realms. Each of these beings was designed to sow terror, their very appearance a shock to the senses and a challenge to the rational mind. They were armed with unpitying weapons and filled with poison instead of blood, their nature intrinsically tied to death and destruction. This was not an army of conquest, but an army of extermination, each soldier a living embodiment of Tiamat's destructive rage. The creation of these 11 horrors represents a key theological concept in the epic. It is a grotesque parody of divine creation. Where the birth of the gods had led to an expansion and organization of the cosmos, Tiamat's spawning leads to the generation of forces meant to dismantle it. She is wielding her primordial power as the mother of all, but for a purely destructive end. This act established the stakes of the coming war in the starkest possible terms. The younger gods were not just fighting for their own survival, they were fighting to preserve a cosmos based on order, distinction, and natural law against a force that sought to overwhelm it with monstrous, chaotic, and unnatural forms. Tiamat's army was the physical manifestation of her will, a legion of horrors unleashed to drag the nascent universe back into the undifferentiated state from which it had so recently emerged. Tiamat's preparation for war moved beyond mere intent and into the realm of strategic military production. The legion of fearsome beings she brought forth was not a haphazard collection of beasts, but the calculated formation of a vanguard, an elite corps designed for a specific tactical purpose. This act was a direct application of her primordial power to the art of warfare, creating a new class of entity that existed solely for combat. The Enuma Elish specifies that she gave birth to creatures like great lions and mad dogs, which represents a significant theological statement. She was not just creating chimeras, but was taking the most potent symbols of natural ferocity and amplifying them to a cosmic scale, perverting the recognizable world to serve as her arsenal. These were not the lions and dogs of the terrestrial plane, but their archetypal forms, imbued with supernatural strength and an unquenchable thirst for divine blood. The assembly of this legion included beings that resonated with the deepest fears of the Mesopotamian psyche. The appearance of scorpion men, for instance, draws upon a well-established mythological figure, a liminal being that guarded the gateways to supernatural realms. By creating her own, or co-opting their allegiance, Tiamat was demonstrating her command over the dark and chaotic forces that existed on the fringes of the ordered world. Each of these monstrous soldiers was a living weapon, their forms honed for maximum lethality and psychological impact. The text emphasizes that she sharpened their teeth and filled their bodies with venom, a graphic depiction of their biological weaponization. They were the perfect shock troops, designed to shatter the morale of an enemy before the main battle was even joined. Critically, Tiamat did not just create these beings, she elevated them. The epic states that she raised them up in the assembly of the gods, a formal act of granting them divine status. This was a direct challenge to the existing divine hierarchy. She was not merely mustering an army of monsters, she was creating a rival pantheon, a dark court of deified horrors whose legitimacy was rooted in her own primordial authority. This act of ennoblement gave them a place in the cosmic order, making them legitimate, if terrifying, actors in the divine drama. Their role as the vanguard was to serve as the front line of her new chaotic order. They were the physical embodiment of her rebellion, a legion of newly minted gods of terror, unleashed to prove that the raw, untamed power of the primordial mother was a force that the ordered world of the younger gods could not hope to withstand. To complete her war preparations, Tiamat required not just an army, but a legitimate military commander. Her choice fell upon Kingu, one of the gods of the older generation, whom she elevated to a position of supreme authority. This act was twofold in its significance. She took him as her new consort, and she appointed him as the general of her forces. The selection of a consort was a deeply political act in the ancient Near East, a way of forming alliances and legitimizing a ruler's authority. By elevating Kingu, Tiamat was not merely choosing a mate, she was creating a new royal dyad at the head of a rival cosmic government. Kingu's status was now second only to her own, a clear and direct challenge to the patriarchal lineage of Anu and Ea. He was to be the king of her new order, the executive power that would carry out her will. The most critical element of this appointment was Tiamat's decision to bestow upon Kingu the Tablet of Destinies, Stupi Shimati. In Mesopotamian theology, this was no mere symbol of power. It was the very instrument of cosmic control. The tablet was a sacred cuneiform document upon which the fates of the universe, gods, and mortals were inscribed. To possess it was to hold the ultimate authority to decree what was and what would be. In the established hierarchy, this authority rightfully belonged to the head of the pantheon, a position traditionally held by gods like Enlil or Anu. By seizing this power and conferring it upon her chosen general, Tiamat was performing a radical and revolutionary act. She was not just challenging the younger god's authority, she was appropriating the fundamental mechanism of cosmic governance. Kingu's elevation to this supreme position, validated by his possession of the tablet, gave Tiamat's rebellion a veneer of legitimacy. He was now, in a legal and theological sense, the rightful ruler of the cosmos, at least according to the authority vested in him by the primordial mother. His command over the monstrous vanguard was now absolute and divinely sanctioned. This strategic move transformed her chaotic rage into a structured military and political campaign. She had created a clear chain of command, established a legitimate, if rival, king, and secured control over the very process of destiny. The younger gods were now faced not with a disorganized mob, but with a formally constituted army, led by a divinely appointed commander who held in his hands the power to decree their own destruction. The revelation of Tiamat's organized rebellion sent a wave of profound terror through the assembly of the younger gods. This was not the simple fear of an impending battle, but a complex state of psychological and political paralysis brought on by the specific nature of the threat they now faced. Their previous confidence, born from Ea's swift and cunning victory over Apsu, was utterly shattered. They were confronted with a reality for which they were completely unprepared. A multi-front war that was at once military, legal, and theological. The sight of Tiamat's monstrous army was in itself a source of deep dread. These were not conventional opponents, but beings of anti-creation. Their very forms a testament to a power that could twist and pervert the natural order. For the gods who represented the principles of cosmic organization, the existence of such creatures was a horrifying spectacle, a tangible sign that their entire worldview was under assault. Compounding this visceral horror was the strategic genius of Tiamat's political maneuvers. The elevation of Kingu and, critically, his investiture with the Tablet of Destinies struck at the very heart of the younger gods' legitimacy. Their own authority was now legally superseded. Kingu was, by the power vested in him by the primordial mother, the new arbiter of fate. This meant that the younger gods were not just facing an enemy army, they were facing the legitimate, if hostile, government of the cosmos. Their status was instantly reduced from that of a ruling council to that of rebels and usurpers. This legal predicament created a crisis of confidence and a state of profound disarray. How could they fight against a commander who held the very instrument that decreed their own destinies? Any action they took could be seen as an act of treason against the rightful cosmic authority. This combination of an overwhelming military force and an unassailable legal position resulted in a state of complete paralysis. The text describes them as being struck dumb and their lips covered in silence. This was not cowardice, but the rational response to a seemingly hopeless situation. Their previous modes of power, Ea's cunning, Anu's remote authority, were rendered impotent. Cunning could not outmaneuver a being who controlled fate itself, and authority was meaningless in the face of a new, higher authority. The younger gods were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and stripped of their legitimacy in a single, masterful stroke. Their terror was born from the sudden and complete realization that they had no viable strategy for survival. They were trapped, facing an enemy whose power was absolute, and whose right to destroy them was now, terrifyingly, enshrined in the cosmic law. In the face of their collective paralysis, the assembly of the younger gods turned to the apex of their established hierarchy, the Sky Father, Anu. This course of action was a logical, almost bureaucratic response to the crisis, reflecting a political system where ultimate authority is appealed to in times of existential threat. The decision to send Anu was an attempt at a diplomatic resolution, a formal embassy from the legitimate king of the ordered cosmos to the leader of the rebellion. His mission was not one of conquest, but of pacification. He was to approach Tiamat and, through the sheer weight of his sovereign authority, command her to stand down. This strategy was predicated on the assumption that the principles of hierarchy and legitimate rule, which formed the basis of the younger gods' worldview, were still universally applicable. It was an attempt to solve a problem of chaotic, primordial power using the tools of political order. Anu's authority was immense, but it was of a specific kind. It was the authority of a remote, majestic sovereign, a power based on established law and divine right within a structured system. His attempt to reason with Tiamat was therefore a test of whether this established order had any jurisdiction over the forces that preceded it. The confrontation that ensued was not a battle, but a complete and utter failure of this principle. When Anu approached the rebel queen, he was not met by a fellow deity open to negotiation. He was confronted by the fully realized, monstrous presence of primordial chaos. The text describes him as being unable to withstand her presence. This was not a failure of courage, but a fundamental incompatibility of being. His ordered, majestic authority was simply nullified by her raw, untamed, and terrifying power. His retreat was immediate and absolute. The epic states that he turned back. A simple phrase that conveys a profound theological and political reality. The old king, the ultimate authority of the established pantheon, was impotent in the face of this new threat. His failure was a definitive statement that the existing cosmic order and its entire system of governance were obsolete. Diplomacy had failed, and the highest law of the land had proven unenforceable. This event plunged the younger gods into an even deeper state of despair, as it proved that their most powerful and legitimate ruler was incapable of protecting them. The mission's failure was a crucial turning point, demonstrating that the crisis could not be resolved through the old ways or by the old powers. It made clear that a new kind of authority, one based not on remote majesty but on active martial prowess, was the only remaining path to survival. Following the utter failure of Anu's diplomatic mission, the desperate assembly of the younger gods turned to their only other established champion, Ea. This was a logical, if desperate, progression. If the supreme authority of the old king had failed, perhaps the superior intellect of the divine magician could succeed. Ea's previous victory over Apsu had been the defining success of their generation, a triumph of cunning over brute force that had established the very foundation of their new order. The expectation, therefore, was that he could devise another masterful incantation or clever stratagem to neutralize this new, more formidable threat. His wisdom was their last remaining strategic asset, the one power that had proven effective against the primordial generation. However, the nature of the threat had fundamentally changed. Apsu had been a plotter, a being with a discernible, if malevolent, plan. He was an entity who could be understood and therefore outmaneuvered. Tiamat in her transformed state was no longer a mere plotter. She had become a personified force of cosmic chaos, a being whose power was not just immense but also conceptually different. Her rage was not a simple emotion that could be soothed or tricked, but a fundamental principle of cosmic reality that was actively unmaking the ordered world. Ea's attempt to confront her was therefore not a contest of wits, but a clash between the principle of intellect and the principle of untamed primordial power. The result was a complete and decisive failure, but one that was different from Anu's. Where Anu was overwhelmed by Tiamat's terrifying presence, Ea was intellectually confounded. The text states that his artifice was confounded, and he retreated. This signifies the failure of wisdom itself. His magic, his incantations, his profound understanding of the cosmic order, all were rendered useless. They were tools designed to operate within a system of discernible laws and principles, and they had no effect on a being who embodied the very negation of that system. This was the desperation of the master strategist, who has encountered an enemy whose actions are not just unpredictable, but operate outside the known rules of engagement. Ea's retreat was the admission that the problem of Tiamat was, for him, unsolvable. This second failure was the final blow to the morale of the younger gods. If neither their highest authority nor their greatest intellect could face this threat, then their entire system of power was bankrupt. They were now truly without a champion, left with no remaining options within their existing hierarchy, and facing a war they had no conceivable means of winning. The consecutive failures of the two highest powers in the pantheon created a complete political and strategic vacuum. With Anu's authority proving irrelevant and Ea's wisdom rendered impotent, the established system of divine governance was demonstrably bankrupt. This state of absolute desperation, however, became the catalyst for a revolutionary realization. The problem could not be solved by the existing hierarchy. A new type of power was required. It was in this context that the collective attention of the divine assembly turned to the young god Marduk. This was not a sudden, hopeful whim, but a logical conclusion born from the systematic failure of all other options. The crisis had effectively served as a divine stress test, revealing the fatal inadequacies of the old guard, and forcing the recognition that a new kind of champion was needed. The call for Marduk was a tacit admission that the qualities that had defined the previous generation of rulers' remote authority and subtle cunning were no longer sufficient. The threat posed by Tiamat was not a political problem to be managed, or a riddle to be solved. It was a physical and existential war that required a martial champion. Marduk's primary qualifications were his youth and his immense active power. His youth was significant because it meant he was unburdened by the traditions and limitations of the old order that had already failed. He represented a new political and theological reality. His power, unlike Anu's latent authority or Ea's intellectual might, was overtly martial and dynamic. He was a warrior god, a being whose very nature was suited to direct, violent confrontation. His courage was not just a moral virtue but a strategic necessity, the willingness to face a force of pure chaos directly, a task that had caused his elders to retreat. This realization, likely first articulated by his own father, the strategist Ea, was the beginning of a cosmic political revolution. In proposing his son, Ea was not just nominating a candidate, he was acknowledging the obsolescence of his own methods and advocating for a new paradigm of leadership. The Assembly's acceptance of this proposal was a radical act. They were agreeing to look for a solution outside of their established power structure, effectively voting no confidence in their own regime. The call for Marduk was therefore the moment the epic pivots from a narrative of desperate defense to one of proactive, aggressive action. The gods were not merely seeking a temporary general. They were, out of sheer necessity, beginning the process of identifying and empowering a new, absolute monarch whose right to rule would be forged not by lineage, but by his singular ability to save them from annihilation. Summoned before the desperate divine assembly, Marduk did not simply accept the role of champion, he dictated the terms of his engagement. This was not an act of youthful arrogance, but a shrewd and calculated political negotiation that represents the central argument of the Enuma Elish. He understood the unprecedented leverage that the crisis afforded him and used it to propose a permanent and radical restructuring of the cosmic government. His conditions were clear, absolute, and non-negotiable. If he were to risk his existence to save the gods, they must, in turn, grant him supreme and irrevocable authority over their entire assembly. This was a demand for a complete transfer of power, a shift from a council-based aristocracy led by a remote patriarch to an absolute monarchy. The core of his demand was for the power to decree the fates. This was a specific and technical claim to the authority embodied in the Tablet of Destinies, the very instrument of cosmic control that Tiamat had conferred upon Kingu. Marduk was not merely asking to be a temporary war leader or primus inter pares. He was demanding that the fundamental power of governance be permanently vested in him alone. His word, he insisted, must become the final law of the universe, and his commands must be unalterable. This was a proposal to replace the old, decentralized system of authority where Anu held sovereignty, Ea held wisdom, and other gods managed their domains, with a new, centralized model where all power flowed from a single, active and martial sovereign. This proposition placed the divine assembly in an impossible position. They were being asked to formally and legally abdicate their own collective authority and create a supreme ruler, an act that was entirely without precedent. It was a constitutional crisis on a cosmic scale. The political ideology underpinning Marduk's demand is a clear reflection of the historical ambitions of Babylon, the city for which he was the patron deity. The epic serves as a divine charter, a mythological justification for the concentration of power in a single ruler and a single city-state. By having the entire pantheon willingly and contractually cede their power to Marduk in exchange for salvation, the poem establishes his future reign not as a usurpation, but as the legitimate and necessary outcome of a formal agreement. The gods' desperation forced them to consider this revolutionary proposal, setting the stage for a vote that would either preserve their traditional but ineffective system or save them from annihilation at the cost of their own sovereignty. To formally address Marduk's revolutionary proposal, the divine community was convened in a great assembly. The location chosen for this momentous council was the celestial court of Anshar, a detail of profound political significance. Anshar, as one of the most ancient and respected of the divine lineage, represented the legitimacy of the old order. By gathering under his authority, the gods were ensuring that their decision, however radical, would be made according to established tradition and law. This was not an informal discussion, but a formal binding legislative session, the mythological equivalent of a pukrum or sacred assembly, a known institution in Mesopotamian city-states, where major political decisions were ratified by a council of elders or citizens. The purpose of this gathering was singular and dire: to deliberate upon the abdication of their own collective sovereignty. The assembly took the form of a great banquet, a common practice in the ancient Near East, where treaties, alliances, and coronations were sealed through communal feasting and drinking. The act of sharing a meal was a ritual that created and affirmed social and political bonds. In this context, however, the banquet was not a celebration but a solemn preparatory rite. The text describes the gods setting up their thrones, drinking fine wine, and eating bread. These were the formal proceedings of a council preparing to conduct its most serious business. The consumption of intoxicating beverages was not for revelry, but was often seen as a way to access a state of heightened consciousness, to fortify the spirit before making a decision of cosmic import. The atmosphere was one of profound gravity, as each deity present understood the irreversible nature of the choice before them. They were gathered to consider Marduk's audacious terms, and there was no illusion about the stakes. The decision was not merely about appointing a war leader, it was about ratifying a new cosmic constitution. They were being asked to willingly and permanently transfer all executive and legislative power to a single unanswerable authority. The gravity of this decision lay in its finality. Once they granted Marduk the power to decree fates, their own authority would be forever diminished, their individual domains subject to his ultimate will. They were contemplating a choice between two forms of oblivion: certain physical annihilation at the hands of Tiamat's monstrous forces, or the political extinction of their own aristocratic, council-based system of governance. The banquet, therefore, was the somber prelude to a vote that would determine not just their survival, but the fundamental political structure of the universe for all time. Before the Divine Assembly would formally cede their collective authority, they required a definitive and public demonstration of Marduk's claimed capabilities. The challenge they devised was not a test of martial prowess or physical strength, but a far more profound examination of his essential divine power. He was not asked to fight a monster or lift a great weight. He was challenged to destroy and then restore a constellation by the power of his spoken word alone. This test was a piece of sophisticated theological theatre designed to prove his mastery over the very fabric of existence. In Mesopotamian thought, the ultimate expression of divine and royal power was the creative and destructive force of the command, kibitu. To bring things into being, or to annihilate them through mere utterance, was the singular prerogative of the highest authority. The assembly was therefore not asking for a show of force, but for a legal and spiritual proof of his qualification for the supreme office he demanded. The choice of a constellation as the subject of the test was deeply significant. The stars were not seen as random points of light, but as the Shittir Shamami, the heavenly writing, a celestial tablet upon which the destinies of the cosmos were inscribed. To have the power to make a constellation vanish was to demonstrate the ability to erase a line of destiny. To make it reappear was to prove the power to write a new one. This was a direct, practical demonstration of the very authority Marduk was claiming the right to decree the fates. By manipulating the heavenly script, he would be proving his worthiness to possess the tablet of destinies. The test was, in essence, a live audit of his cosmic administrative capabilities. The dual nature of the challenge destruction, followed by restoration, was the critical element. Any number of lesser deities or chaotic forces might possess the power to destroy. Tiamat herself was a being of immense destructive potential. True sovereignty, however, was demonstrated not just by the ability to unmake, but by the power to create and restore. This twofold act would prove that Marduk was not simply another agent of chaos, but a master of the entire cosmic cycle. His success would establish him as a responsible and complete ruler, capable of wielding both the negative and positive aspects of absolute power. The performance of this miracle before the entire pantheon would serve as the final irrefutable argument in his bid for the monarchy, a public and legally binding demonstration that his word alone was sufficient to govern reality. Upon the successful and irrefutable demonstration of his power, the atmosphere within the divine assembly transformed from one of grave deliberation to one of exultant relief. Marduk's mastery over creation and destruction was not just a spectacle, it was the legally binding proof of his qualification for the supreme office he had demanded. The gods' response was immediate and unanimous. They joyfully proclaimed him as their undisputed king. This was not a spontaneous outburst of emotion, but the formal and ritualized conclusion of a political process. The epic describes them constructing a royal dais for him, an act that symbolizes the creation of a new seat of power, a physical throne for the new cosmic monarch. By doing this, they were not merely honoring a champion, they were participating in the establishment of a new institution of absolute kingship. The proclamation itself was a performative legal act, mirroring the coronation rituals of terrestrial Mesopotamian kings. The gods bowed down before him, a gesture of fealty that signified their collective submission to his authority. They bestowed upon him the scepter, the throne, and the royal regalia, the traditional insignia of legitimate rule. This transfer of power was contractual and complete. They had offered him sovereignty in exchange for their salvation, he had proven his worthiness, and they were now fulfilling their side of the bargain. The text emphasizes their joy in this act, a crucial detail for the political ideology of the Enuma Elish. The gods are not resentful subjects being forced into submission. They are willing and grateful participants in the creation of a new, more effective form of government. Their joy is the joy of a populace that has found a competent leader in a time of existential crisis, and they willingly trade their own autonomy for the security that his absolute rule promises. This event marks the formal end of the old divine aristocracy and the beginning of the new monarchy. The proclamation was a constitutional amendment on a cosmic scale, ratified by the unanimous consent of the governed. The gods declared, "Marduk is king." This simple declarative statement, repeated in the text, functions as a legally binding coronation formula. His kingship was now an established fact, his authority absolute, and his right to rule undisputed by the assembly of the ordered gods. His first and immediate task, now that he was formally enthroned, was to confront Tiamat. His coronation was therefore not the beginning of a peaceful reign, but his formal commissioning as the commander-in-chief of the divine armies, empowered by the full, abdicated authority of the entire pantheon to wage a war for the survival of the cosmos. With his kingship formally proclaimed and his authority established by divine law, Marduk's final preparation for the cosmic duel was a ritual of investiture, an arming ceremony that was as much a theological statement as a military necessity. This was not the simple equipping of a soldier, but the systematic transfer of the collective martial power of the pantheon into the hands of their new, singular monarch. Each weapon bestowed upon him was a symbol of a specific divine function, and by receiving them, Marduk was not just borrowing their power, he was subsuming their roles. The epic's detailed catalogue of his arsenal serves as a mythological inventory of cosmic power, now consolidated in a single executive authority. He was given the bow, a weapon with deep resonance in Mesopotamian iconography, often depicted as the personal weapon of the highest gods, and a symbol of their power to enact judgment from a distance. The bow given to Marduk was of a cosmic scale, its arrows capable of traversing the heavens. This established him as the ultimate divine archer, a being whose reach was limitless and whose sentence was inescapable. He also received the mace, perhaps the most ancient and potent symbol of royal and military authority in the ancient Near East. Kings and gods alike were depicted wielding the mace as a sign of their power to crush rebellion and enforce order. By taking up this weapon, Marduk was formally assuming the role of the divine enforcer, the strong arm of the new cosmic government. Furthermore, he was armed with the lightning, the quintessential attribute of the great storm gods like Adad or the earlier Sumerian Enlil. In the Mesopotamian climate, the storm god was a figure of immense power, capable of both devastating destruction and life-giving rain. For Marduk, the patron deity of a city, to be given command of the lightning was a radical theological move, effectively appropriating the primary function of one of the most powerful and ancient deities in the pantheon. He was becoming the new storm god, the new master of the most dramatic and powerful forces of nature. This arsenal was completed by a great net, another traditional divine weapon used to ensnare and subdue cosmic enemies. This collection of arms was a clear statement. Marduk was now the sole wielder of all forms of divine power, the distant judgment of the archer, the close quarters authority of the king, and the elemental fury of the storm. He was the fully equipped executive of the divine will, preparing to face chaos itself, not as one god among many, but as the unified and total power of the cosmos. Beyond the conventional divine arsenal bestowed upon him by the assembly, Marduk's preparation for battle involved the marshalling of a different and more terrifying category of power, he took command of the 7 evil winds, elemental forces that in Mesopotamian demonology were not mere meteorological phenomena, but malevolent, semi-sentient entities of pure destruction. These were not the ordinary winds of the storm god, but a specific and infamous group of demonic powers often invoked in incantation texts as the cause of disease, famine, and madness. They were agents of chaos, beings that existed outside the ordered divine hierarchy, and were typically viewed as hostile to both gods and mortals. For Marduk to prepare for battle by summoning and taking command of these forces was a profound and audacious act. His ability to control them was a demonstration of a power that surpassed even that of the traditional high gods. It signified his mastery not just over the forces of order, but over the very agents of chaos themselves. He was not merely a king who could command armies. He was a cosmic sovereign whose authority extended to the most lawless and destructive corners of existence. This act of pressing demonic forces into divine service was a powerful theological statement. It suggested that the new monarch was so absolute in his power that even the most untamable elements of the universe were subject to his will. He was not destroying chaos, but harnessing it, turning its own destructive potential back upon its source. The 7 winds were to be his vanguard, a tactical weapon of overwhelming and terrifying force. The epic names them individually: the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, the fourfold wind, the sevenfold wind, the cyclone, the unrivaled wind, each name representing a different aspect of their destructive capability. By placing them at his side, Marduk was integrating the most feared forces in the cosmos into his own military apparatus. This was a clear signal that the coming battle would not be a conventional conflict fought according to established rules of engagement. He was preparing to meet Tiamat's monstrous, unnatural army with an equally terrifying elemental force of his own. This move demonstrated his complete understanding of the nature of his enemy and his willingness to wield any and all available power, whether ordered or chaotic, to achieve victory and secure the future of the cosmos. To complete his transformation into the supreme divine warrior, Marduk required a conveyance appropriate to his new status and the cosmic scale of the impending battle. He mounted a fearsome storm chariot, a piece of military technology that was, in the ancient Near East, the ultimate symbol of royal power and martial supremacy. The war chariot was the most advanced and devastating weapon of the Bronze and Iron Ages, a mobile firing platform that conferred immense advantage upon any army that could field it. For a god to possess a chariot was to mark him as a king and a general. For Marduk to possess a storm chariot was to explicitly identify him with the traditional role of the great storm gods like Adad or Enlil, whose thundering chariots were believed to cause the storms that swept across the Mesopotamian plains. This was the final and most visible act in his appropriation of the powers of the older pantheon. The chariot was not merely a vehicle, it was a divine weapon system, a manifestation of the storm itself, described as a whirlwind and a tempest. It was drawn not by ordinary animals, but by 4 terrible steeds, each given a name that personified a specific aspect of the destructive force of war. This practice of naming significant weapons or conveyances was common in epic literature, serving to elevate them from mere objects to active participants in the narrative. The first was Slayer, representing the raw lethality of combat. The second, Remorseless, embodied the pitiless nature of divine judgment, a force that acts without sentiment or hesitation. The third, Fleet, signified the speed and overwhelming momentum of a chariot charge, the ability to strike suddenly and decisively. The fourth, Flyer, suggested a supernatural mobility, the capacity to traverse the cosmos and engage the enemy wherever they might be found. By harnessing these 4 personified concepts of destruction, Marduk was demonstrating his absolute command over the very essence of warfare. His advance toward his foe was therefore not just the movement of a single god, but the inexorable progress of a complete and perfectly articulated engine of war. The imagery of a king in his chariot leading his forces was a familiar and potent one for the Babylonian audience of the Enuma Elish, a direct reflection of their own world's highest expression of military power. By mounting his storm chariot, drawn by his terrible steeds, Marduk was fully assuming the role of the divine king, Sharu, the legitimate and all-powerful monarch, advancing to bring order to his realm through the overwhelming application of force. His journey to the battlefield was his coronation procession, a terrifying parade of the new absolute power that now governed the cosmos. The advance of Marduk toward the forces of chaos was not the movement of an army or a mere journey to a battlefield. It was the procession of a new cosmic principle in motion. His march was the first executive action of the newly constituted monarchy, a singular expression of the total consolidated power that had been legally vested in him by the divine assembly. Radiating an aura of terrifying divine power, his Malamu, he was not just an imposing figure, but a walking embodiment of the new political reality. This effulgence was a tangible weapon of statecraft, a projection of legitimate authority so potent that it was intended to demoralize his enemies and affirm his rightful dominion before the first blow was even struck. He was the legitimate king, and his advance was the formal process of bringing his chaotic and rebellious territories back under central authority. By wielding the storm itself as his personal weapon, he was demonstrating a fundamental shift in the nature of divine power. In the older pantheon, elemental forces were distributed among various deities, creating a decentralized and sometimes conflicting system of cosmic governance. Marduk's command of the storm signified the end of this aristocratic distribution of power. All elemental forces were now subsumed under his singular executive will. The storm was no longer an independent force of nature governed by a specialized deity. It was now an instrument of state policy, a tool to be deployed by the monarch to enforce his decree. His advance was therefore the advance of a unified, centralized cosmos against the fragmented and lawless power of the primordial past. Upon his shoulders rested the entire weight of the newly ratified cosmic order. He was not merely a champion fighting for his own glory or the survival of his kin. He was the sole guarantor of the divine constitution that the gods had just adopted. His failure would not just mean their deaths, it would mean the legal and actual dissolution of the principle of ordered existence. The fate of the cosmos, in a very literal and political sense, depended entirely on the outcome of this single combat. He was the embodiment of the law, and his march was the act of enforcing that law against a rebellion that sought to plunge reality back into a pre-legal, pre-political state of being. His was the first and ultimate test of the new monarchy, a trial by combat to determine whether a universe governed by a single, all-powerful sovereign was a viable and sustainable model for existence. The meeting of the two champions was not an accidental encounter, but a formal, prearranged confrontation in a liminal space, a conceptual battlefield where the foundational principles of the cosmos were to be decided by single combat. This was the ultimate trial by ordeal, a legal and military process familiar to the ancient Near East, where the victor was proven to be in the right by the very fact of their victory. The exchange that preceded the physical struggle was therefore not a mere exchange of insults, but a crucial part of the legal process. It was a final, public declaration of grievances and justifications, a verbal contest of legitimacy that set the stage for the physical one. Tiamat, as the aggrieved primordial mother, likely opened the proceedings, her challenge a furious indictment of the new generation. She would have accused Marduk of being a usurper, a patricidal upstart whose authority was illegitimate, and whose very existence was an offense to the natural ancient order. Marduk's response was not a defense, but a counter-prosecution. He did not argue his case on the basis of primordial right, but on the unassailable foundation of positive law. He would have presented himself not as a rebel, but as the legally constituted sovereign, the duly elected executive of the divine state. His authority, he would have declared, was not self-arrogated, but was freely and formally conferred upon him by the unanimous vote of the divine assembly. This made his actions not a rebellion, but a legitimate police action, He was not a usurper, he was the king, and Tiamat was the traitor. This verbal exchange framed the conflict in starkly political terms. Tiamat's claim was based on the ancient unwritten law of primordial being, while Marduk's was based on the new codified law of the organized state. This confrontation was the definitive clash between two opposing models of power. Tiamat represented the chaotic, familial, and decentralized authority of the primordial past. Marduk embodied the ordered, legalistic, and centralized power of the new monarchical state, a political model that mirrored the rise of Babylon itself. The epic struggle that was about to unfold was therefore not just a fight for survival, it was the mythological enactment of the process of state formation. The taunts and challenges were the final legal arguments before the court of the cosmos, with the verdict to be rendered not by a judge, but by the overwhelming application of force. Each champion had stated their case, and the epic struggle was now set to determine which legal and political reality would govern the universe. The initial engagement of the cosmic battle was not an exchange of blows, but a calculated tactical maneuver designed to neutralize the primary strategic advantage of the enemy. Marduk's first act was to cast a great net, a weapon that in Mesopotamian religious and political iconography was laden with profound meaning. The divine net was not a common tool of war, but a specific instrument of supreme justice, a symbol of the inescapable power of the highest gods to enforce their decrees upon the cosmos. In numerous other myths and royal inscriptions, gods like the Sumerian Enlil or the Assyrian Ashur are depicted wielding a net to ensnare their enemies, both divine and mortal. It was the ultimate expression of sovereign power, a tool that represented the ability of the state to capture and contain any force that threatened its order. The fact that this weapon was a gift from Anu, the Sky Father, is a detail of immense legal and theological importance. It was not merely a loan of military hardware. It was a formal and public transfer of the supreme judicial function. Anu, as the traditional head of the pantheon, was the ultimate judge. By bestowing his personal net upon Marduk, he was officially deputizing him as the executive arm of the divine court. Marduk was now not just a champion fighting for survival. He was a legally commissioned bailiff, empowered by the highest authority to arrest a fugitive from cosmic law. The casting of the net was therefore the serving of a divine warrant, a legal act that transformed the battlefield into a courtroom and the impending duel into a formal trial by combat. The choice of the net was also a matter of perfect tactical and theological suitability. Tiamat's power was that of the primordial sea fluid, chaotic, formless, and overwhelming. A conventional weapon like a sword or a mace would be difficult to employ against such an amorphous and vast opponent. The net, however, was the ideal countermeasure. It is a weapon of containment, a tool that imposes a grid-like structure upon the unstructured. By ensnaring Tiamat, Marduk was not just physically restraining her, he was symbolically imposing the principle of order upon the very embodiment of chaos. He was capturing the formless in a web of form, defining and limiting her being so that she could be addressed and judged. The act was designed to prevent her from escaping his divine judgment, ensuring that the legal process, which had begun with their verbal confrontation, would proceed to its violent but necessary conclusion. The unfailing net was the first and most critical step in the subjugation of chaos, a masterful fusion of legal process and military strategy. The central and decisive act of the cosmic duel was not a prolonged exchange of blows, but a single, brilliant tactical maneuver that demonstrated Marduk's perfect synthesis of brute force and strategic intellect. With Tiamat momentarily contained but still a formidable threat, Marduk unleashed his most unconventional weapon, the Imhullu, the evil wind. This was not a meteorological phenomenon, but one of the 7 demonic elemental forces he had previously marshaled. The deployment of this specific power was a masterstroke of theological and military strategy. He was using a pure agent of chaos, a force that existed outside the divine order, as the primary instrument for the establishment of that very order. This act proved his absolute sovereignty, demonstrating a power so complete that he could weaponize the very essence of lawlessness to enforce the law. The opportunity for this decisive strike was provided by Tiamat's own aggression. In her fury, she opened her mouth to roar, an act intended to consume her opponent. In the mythological context, this roaring maw was the gateway to the primordial abyss, the void of chaos that threatened to swallow the nascent, ordered cosmos. Marduk, however, did not recoil from this threat, but perceived it as a critical vulnerability. In a move that showcased the cunning inherited from his father, Ea, he exploited this opening, turning his enemy's greatest weapon against her. He drove the Imhulu directly into her open mouth, a tactical decision that shifted the battle from an external confrontation to an internal overwhelming assault. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The wind, a force of immense and uncontrolled expansion, surged into Tiamat's body, distending her from within. The text graphically describes her belly being inflated, a grotesque and humiliating violation that left her unable to close her mouth or control her own form. This was not a simple injury. It was the total incapacitation of a cosmic principle. Chaos, which is by nature formless and boundless, was being forcibly and painfully given a form and a boundary by a power it could not contain. This internal assault left her utterly helpless, her offensive capabilities neutralized, and her massive body rendered immobile. This was the true moment of victory, the strategic checkmate that preceded the final physical blow. Marduk had not just defeated his enemy in combat, he had proven his intellectual and tactical superiority by subduing the principle of chaos from the inside out. With the principle of chaos physically incapacitated and rendered helpless, the final act of the cosmic duel was not a continuation of the battle, but the formal execution of a divine sentence. Marduk, in his capacity as the newly enthroned sovereign and legally commissioned judge, proceeded to carry out the verdict that Tiamat's rebellion had necessitated. He fired a single, mighty arrow, an act that was the physical consummation of the legal process that had begun in the divine assembly. This was not a desperate shot in the heat of combat. It was the deliberate and final enforcement of the new cosmic law. The arrow itself, launched from the great bow that symbolized his far-reaching authority, was the very instrument of the fate he now decreed. Its trajectory was not a matter of chance, but the unalterable path of a royal decree made manifest. The projectile's path was described with a graphic and theologically potent precision. It tore through Tiamat's belly, the very seat of her primordial creative power, the source from which the first gods and her monstrous legion had been born. This was a profound symbolic act, representing the violent and definitive sterilization of the chaotic maternal principle. The new order, personified by Marduk, was asserting its dominance by neutralizing the very womb of the old one. The arrow then proceeded to pierce her heart, the center of her will and the source of her rebellious rage. This was the final fatal blow, the act that extinguished not just her life, but her very being as a conscious opposing force in the cosmos. The slaying was a complete and total deconstruction of her power, both creative and destructive. The death of the primordial mother of all was the single most important event in the history of the cosmos, the act that made all subsequent creation possible. Her slaying was a cosmic matricide, the necessary, if brutal, foundation of a new patriarchal order. It represented the irreversible victory of a universe governed by law, decree, and a single male sovereign over a universe born from a chaotic, female, and untamed source. This was not merely the death of an enemy, it was the death of an entire mode of existence. With her defeat, the threat of a regression to the formless, undifferentiated state was permanently eliminated. The cosmos was now a blank slate, the raw material of the slain chaos monster, ready to be repurposed by the victorious king. The arrow of fate had not just ended a war, it had cleared the ground for the construction of a new ordered reality. The death of the commander in ancient warfare was not merely a tactical setback, it was a catastrophic failure of the army's central nervous system, and the effect of Tiamat's fall upon her forces was immediate and absolute. Her monstrous army was not a professional military corps with a formal chain of command and a coherent political objective. It was a manifestation of her personal will, a host of beings whose existence and purpose were inextricably bound to her own. With her death, their unifying principle was extinguished. The divine rage that had animated them was gone, and in its place was a conceptual vacuum. The result was not a strategic retreat or a regrouping, but an instantaneous and total collapse of morale and cohesion. The army was thrown into a state of complete disarray, its very reason for being having been annihilated before their eyes. Their attempt to flee was not a coordinated withdrawal, but a panicked and chaotic rout. Each of the 11 horrors, beings of immense power in their own right, was now an isolated agent of chaos, stripped of its collective purpose. This moment in the epic serves as a powerful political statement. A force based on pure negative emotion, however powerful, lacks the structural integrity to survive the loss of its leader. It is a personality cult, not a state. The monstrous vanguard, which had been the terror of the cosmos, was revealed to be nothing more than a collection of powerful but purposeless entities, their brief unity dissolving back into the disorganization from which it had been spawned. Their flight was the flight of a shattered ideology, a desperate scramble for survival by beings who had just witnessed the definitive failure of their entire worldview. Marduk's response to this rout was not a chaotic pursuit, but the systematic and orderly process of imposing state control. He once again deployed the great net of Anu, but this time its function was different. It was not a weapon for single combat, but an instrument of mass policing, the divine equivalent of a dragnet operation. By casting it over the fleeing host, he was performing the first great act of law enforcement of his new reign. He was rounding up the enemies of the state, the agents of a failed and illegitimate rebellion. Their capture was not a mere military convenience, it was a legal necessity. The new cosmic order could not be secure while these personifications of chaos remained at large. Their imprisonment was the establishment of the first cosmic penal system, a demonstration that the new monarchy possessed not only the power to defeat its enemies, but the administrative capacity to contain them permanently. This was not an act of vengeance, but of security, the necessary and methodical clean-up operation required to pacify a rebellious province and secure the foundations of the new kingdom. Amidst the general rout of the chaotic host, Marduk's attention was focused on a single high-value target, Kingu. The capture of the rebel general was not an incidental part of the mop-up operation. It was its primary political and legal objective. Kingu was not just another enemy combatant. He was the pretender to the cosmic throne, the being in whom Tiamat had vested the ultimate authority of the old order. His capture was therefore not a matter of military strategy, but of profound constitutional importance. As long as he remained at large and in possession of the Tablet of Destinies, Tiamat's rival government, however broken, still possessed a legitimate figurehead and a claim to cosmic rule. His apprehension was the necessary and final act in the decapitation of the rebellion. The act of stripping him of the Tablet of Destinies was the central, symbolic, and practical goal of this action. This was the moment of the definitive transfer of power. Marduk's own authority to decree the fates had been granted to him by the vote of the divine assembly, a legitimate but delegated power. By physically seizing the tablet from the designated heir of the primordial order, he was transforming his authority from a conferred right into a possessed reality. This was the mythological equivalent of a victorious king seizing the crown and scepter from his defeated rival. The tablet was the ultimate regalia of the cosmos, and its possession was the irrefutable proof of legitimate sovereignty. The text describes Marduk taking the tablet, sealing it with his own seal, and fastening it to his breast. This was a formal, legalistic process, a ritual of appropriation that legitimized his rule through the time-honored principle of right of conquest. This act solidified Marduk's claim to supreme authority over all creation in a way that the Assembly's vote alone could not. His power was now validated by both legal mandate and military victory. He had not just been given the kingship, he had taken it. The capture of Kingu and the seizure of the tablet was the final and most critical step in the cosmic coup d'état. It eliminated the last vestige of the rival regime and concentrated the ultimate instrument of cosmic governance in the hands of the new monarch. Kingu himself, now stripped of his authority and his purpose, was bound and numbered among the defeated gods, his brief reign over the forces of chaos brought to an ignominious end. The universe now had a single, undisputed source of law and destiny, and its physical manifestation rested upon the chest of the victorious Marduk. With the cosmic rebellion definitively crushed and all legal and military authority consolidated in his hands, Marduk transitioned from his role as divine warrior to that of cosmic artisan. The first act of his new reign was not one of governance, but of creation, a process that in the Mesopotamian worldview was not an act of making something from nothing, but of imposing order upon a pre-existing, chaotic substance. The raw material for this creation was the massive corpse of Tiamat. Marduk's first action was to stand upon her defeated body, a powerful and universally understood gesture of absolute domination in the ancient Near East, the conqueror planting his standard on the soil of the vanquished. He then began the methodical process of her dismemberment, an act that was at once a brutal execution and a deliberate act of cosmic engineering. He first split her skull with his mace, the very symbol of his newly won kingship. This was not a final vengeful blow, but the preparatory act of a craftsman breaking down a large raw element into a more manageable form. The text then employs a striking and domestic simile. He sliced her body in two, like a shellfish. This specific imagery is the key to understanding the Babylonian conception of this event. It reframes a moment of unimaginable cosmic violence as a simple, practical, and controlled act of preparation. It is the language of a butcher or a cook, not a frenzied warrior. This simile strips the act of any remaining chaos and establishes Marduk's action as one of deliberate, methodical craftsmanship. He is not tearing his enemy apart in a rage. He is skillfully dividing a resource to be used for a specific, constructive purpose. This act is the central pivot of the Enuma Elish, the moment where the negative, destructive phase of the cosmic drama ends and the positive, creative phase begins. Tiamat, the living, monstrous personification of chaos, is transformed into Tiamat, the inert, physical matter from which the ordered universe will be built. Her being is not annihilated, but repurposed. This is a fundamental tenet of Mesopotamian cosmology. The ordered world is not a separate reality from chaos, but is constructed directly from its substance. The very fabric of the cosmos is therefore composed of the defeated enemy. This establishes a world view in which the forces of chaos are not external threats, but are the very foundation upon which order is built and must be perpetually maintained. Marduk's division of the corpse was the first and most essential step in this process, the act of a divine sovereign taking the raw, untamed territory of his conquered enemy and preparing to impose upon it the structure and law of his new kingdom. With the raw material of the cosmos now prepared, Marduk began the first great act of cosmic architecture. He took one half of Tiamat's dismembered corpse and used it to create the roof of the heavens. In the Mesopotamian cosmological model, the sky was not an empty expanse, but a solid firmament, a physical barrier designed to hold back the chaotic waters that existed above the ordered world. The theological brilliance of this act lies in its profound irony. The body of the primordial sea monster was repurposed to become the very structure that would forever contain the chaotic waters she once embodied. This was not a simple act of construction. It was a feat of cosmic engineering that transformed a source of terror into a source of stability. The chaotic principle was not annihilated, but was made a permanent, structural component of the ordered universe, a constant reminder of the power that had been subdued to make creation possible. Having established this celestial vault, Marduk proceeded to organize its interior with the precision of a divine administrator. He established the constellations, an act of immense importance for the Babylonian worldview. The stars were not considered random points of light, but the Shitir Shamami, the heavenly writing, a divine script upon which the will of the gods and the destinies of the world were inscribed. By arranging the stars into the familiar patterns of the zodiac and other constellations, Marduk was not just decorating the sky, he was writing the first cosmic laws, establishing the calendar, and creating the very basis for the science of astrology and omen reading, which was central to Mesopotamian religion and statecraft. He created a predictable, observable system that allowed for the regulation of time, the determination of seasons for agriculture, and the interpretation of divine will. The heavens were transformed from a chaotic void into a divine tablet, a source of information and regulation for the entire cosmos. To manage this newly organized celestial domain, Marduk set the watchman of the stars. This refers to the planets, whose seemingly erratic movements against the fixed background of the constellations were a subject of intense study for Babylonian astronomers. These celestial bodies were understood to be the divine agents of the high gods, messengers, and administrators who carried out the decrees written in the stars. By setting them in their courses and assigning them their duties, Marduk was creating a celestial bureaucracy, a system of divine governors to ensure the smooth operation of his new cosmic state. He was establishing a chain of command that reached from his own royal court to the furthest corners of the heavens. This act of astronomical organization was the ultimate expression of his new kingship, demonstrating his ability not just to conquer, but to create a stable, predictable, and, most importantly, governable universe. Having secured and organized the celestial realm, Marduk turned his attention to the lower half of the cosmos, fashioning the terrestrial world from the remaining portion of Tiamat's body. This act of creation was a direct parallel to his formation of the heavens, establishing a fundamental symmetry in the new universal structure. The Earth, in the Mesopotamian cosmological model, was conceived as a vast, flat disk, and Marduk's act of fashioning it from the substance of defeated chaos was a powerful theological statement. It meant that the world inhabited by humanity was not a pristine, separate creation, but was intrinsically and physically composed of the same primordial chaotic matter as the sky above. This established a worldview in which the potential for chaos was not an external threat to be kept at bay, but was the very foundation upon which the ordered world was built. The text specifies that Marduk laid this newly fashioned earth over the primordial waters of the Apsu. This detail is a precise reflection of Mesopotamian geography and cosmology. The inhabitants of the Fertile Crescent understood their world to be a landmass floating upon a great subterranean freshwater ocean, the Apsu, which was the source of their rivers, springs, and wells. Marduk's action was therefore not a creation ex nihilo, but an act of cosmic land reclamation. He was establishing a stable, habitable surface upon the tamed and now controlled domain of his father, Ea. This created a three-tiered universe: the celestial vault above, the terrestrial plane in the middle, and the freshwater deep below. The Earth was thus positioned as a liminal space, a buffer zone between the ordered heavens and the powerful, though now subdued, waters of the Apsu. This act of fashioning the Earth had profound implications for the relationship between the divine and the terrestrial. By constructing the world from the body of a defeated goddess, Marduk was ensuring that the very ground upon which future life would exist was sacred, albeit in a complex and somewhat dangerous way. The mountains were imagined as being formed from her skull, the rivers from the flow of her blood, and the land itself from her torso. This meant that the physical world was not inert matter, but the transformed substance of a divine being. This worldview, common in many ancient cosmogonies, established an intimate and unbreakable connection between the physical landscape and the divine drama that had preceded its creation. The world was a battlefield, a tomb, and a temple all at once, its very existence a constant testament to the victory of the new monarch, Marduk, over the forces of primordial chaos. Following the establishment of the great cosmic structures, Marduk's creative process shifted from the general to the specific, moving from the abstract architecture of the cosmos to the vital, life-sustaining features of the terrestrial plane. His next act was one of precise and potent anatomical engineering. He pierced Tiamat's eyes and from these 2 points he brought forth the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This detail of the cosmogony is a masterful piece of etiological myth-making, a direct and powerful explanation for the most critical feature of the Mesopotamian landscape. For the inhabitants of the land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates were not merely geographical features, they were the absolute precondition for existence. Their waters irrigated the fields, their annual floods deposited the fertile silt that made agriculture possible, and their paths dictated the placement of cities and the flow of commerce. To explain their origin was to explain the origin of civilization itself. The choice of Tiamat's eyes as the source is theologically profound. The eyes are the organs of perception and will. By transforming them into the headwaters of the great rivers, Marduk was not just finding a convenient anatomical source, he was fundamentally repurposing the very seat of Tiamat's rebellious consciousness. Her gaze, which had once surveyed her monstrous army with malevolent intent, was now transformed into a life-giving flow. This act represents the ultimate subjugation of chaos. Its very perception is turned into the foundation of order and sustenance. However, the origin of these vital arteries in a being of such violent and untamed nature also provides a mythological explanation for the river's dual character. The Tigris and Euphrates were not just benevolent providers, they were also unpredictable and terrifyingly destructive forces, whose catastrophic floods could wipe out crops, herds, and entire settlements. This violent aspect of the rivers was thus understood to be an inherent part of their nature, a lingering trace of the chaotic fury of the goddess from whose very being they flowed. This specific act of creation served to ground the universal cosmic drama of the Enuma Elish in the immediate, local reality of its Babylonian audience. The great battle between the gods was not a distant, abstract event. Its consequences were written directly onto their homeland. Every time they drew water for their crops, navigated the currents for trade, or built dikes to protect against a flood, they were interacting with the transformed substance of the primordial chaos monster. The veins of the earth, the lifeblood of their civilization, were a constant and tangible reminder of Marduk's victory and the violent, chaotic power that lay just beneath the surface of their ordered world. Marduk's creative work continued with the establishment of the dynamic systems that would govern the newly formed world. Having set the great static structures of the heavens and the earth, he now turned his attention to the atmosphere, the liminal space between them. The Enuma Elish specifies that he used Tiamat's spittle to create the clouds, and from this, the rain and the fog. This act of meteorological creation is another example of etiological myth-making, providing a divine origin for the weather phenomena that were of critical importance to the agricultural societies of Mesopotamia. The choice of spittle, a substance of contempt and insignificance, as the raw material for the life-giving clouds and rain is a powerful theological statement. It is the ultimate demonstration of Marduk's transformative power. He can take a substance that is base and worthless and repurpose it into a vital component of the cosmic order. This act was the establishment of the world's weather systems. In the arid climate of southern Mesopotamia, the control of water was the central organizing principle of society. Rain was a precious and often scarce resource, a direct gift from the heavens that could mean the difference between abundance and famine. Fog and dew were also important sources of moisture, particularly in the cooler seasons. By attributing the origin of these phenomena to a specific, deliberate act by the new cosmic monarch, the Babylonian theologians were asserting that the weather was not a random or chaotic force, but a regulated system, a part of the divine administration established by Marduk. He was not just the king of the gods, he was the master of the hydrological cycle, the ultimate guarantor of the agricultural prosperity upon which their civilization was built. Furthermore, the creation of these atmospheric waters from the substance of Tiamat served to explain their often unpredictable and dangerous nature. Just as the rivers retained a trace of her chaotic fury in their devastating floods, so too did the weather. The gentle, life-giving rain could also manifest as a violent, destructive thunderstorm, and the cool, moisturizing fog could become a blinding and disorienting miasma. These negative aspects of the weather were thus understood to be an inherent part of their origin, a lingering echo of the chaotic power from which they were formed. Marduk's creation of the weather was therefore not the creation of a perfect, idyllic system, but the establishment of a managed, functional one. He had taken the chaotic potential of the primordial mother, embodied in her very saliva, and transformed it into the dynamic, life-sustaining, and occasionally dangerous weather systems that defined the world. With the physical architecture of the universe complete, Marduk's final and most crucial act of creation was political. He turned his attention from the construction of the cosmos to the organization of its government, a process that in the Mesopotamian worldview was the ultimate expression of a legitimate monarch's power. This was the establishment of a stable and functional divine bureaucracy. Marduk began to assign the great gods their various domains and responsibilities, an act that was a direct mythological reflection of a terrestrial king appointing his regional governors and cabinet ministers. This process was not a collegial discussion among peers, but the unilateral decree of an absolute sovereign. The other gods, having willingly abdicated their authority, were now to receive it back, but in a new, diminished, and clearly defined form. Their power was no longer inherent, it was a delegated authority, a specific portfolio of responsibilities granted to them by the crown. This act of divine administration created a stable and predictable hierarchy, replacing the chaotic and often conflicting system of the older pantheon. The text specifies that the three highest celestial stations were assigned to the great gods of the old guard, Anu, Enlil, and Ea. This was a shrewd political move, a co-opting of the former ruling class into the new regime. Anu was confirmed in his traditional domain in the highest heaven, his remote majesty now serving as a symbol of the new order's legitimacy. Ea was established as the master of the Apsu, his wisdom now formally placed in the service of the new king. The position of Enlil, traditionally the most active and powerful of the old triad, was more complex, as many of his functions, particularly that of the storm god, had been subsumed by Marduk himself. His new role was likely that of a senior counselor, his authority now subordinate to the new monarch. This establishment of divine dwellings and the assignment of specific duties was the final and most important step in the victory of order over chaos. It was not enough to defeat the enemy and build a world. That world had to be governed. By creating this clear chain of command and division of labor, Marduk was ensuring the long-term stability of his creation. Each god now had a defined function, a specific sphere of influence, and a clear understanding of their place within the cosmic state. They were no longer independent aristocrats, but ministers in Marduk's government. This transformation from a loose confederation of divine powers into a centralized bureaucratic empire was the ultimate political argument of the Enuma Elish. It was the mythological charter for the Babylonian state, a divine precedent for a world ruled not by a council of competing interests, but by the single, unchallengeable will of a legitimate and all-powerful king. The successful establishment of the cosmic state did not result in a period of divine leisure, but in the immediate commencement of its administration. The gods, now installed in their assigned stations and tasked with their specific duties, were confronted with the reality of their new existence, the endless and burdensome labor required to maintain the newly created cosmos. This narrative turn, where the victorious deities complain about the toil of their new roles, is a recurring and central theme in Mesopotamian mythology, most notably in the Atrahasis epic, which also uses a divine labor dispute as the direct catalyst for the creation of humanity. The complaint was not an expression of ingratitude or rebellion, but a statement of a fundamental problem in the design of the universe. The cosmos, having been built from the substance of chaos, was not a self-sustaining system. It required constant, active maintenance to prevent it from lapsing back into disorder. The labor of the gods was the work of cosmic infrastructure management. It was the ceaseless effort of keeping the celestial bodies moving in their decreed paths, of regulating the newly established weather systems, and of ensuring the proper functioning of the terrestrial world. This was the divine equivalent of dredging canals, maintaining temple complexes, and enforcing the king's law, the mundane but essential work that underpinned Mesopotamian civilization. The gods were now the divine civil service, the cosmic bureaucracy tasked with the day-to-day operation of a vast and complex state. The burden of this work was immense, and critically, it was perpetual. Their complaint was not about a temporary hardship, but about the prospect of an eternity of unceasing toil. The victory over chaos had not led to a state of divine rest, but had simply replaced the terror of war with the drudgery of work. This divine complaint presented the new monarch Marduk with his first major post-war crisis. He had proven his worth as a warrior, a lawgiver, and a creator, but now he faced a challenge to his administrative acumen. The dissatisfaction of his ministers and governors was a direct threat to the stability of his new regime. A government whose functionaries are on the verge of a labour strike is not a secure one. His solution to this problem would be his final and most ingenious act of creation, a move that would not only solve the immediate labour crisis, but would also define the relationship between the divine and the terrestrial for all time. The god's complaint was therefore the necessary narrative pretext for the creation of a subordinate class of beings, a workforce that could take upon itself the burden of cosmic maintenance, freeing the divine aristocracy to engage in the more leisurely and dignified pursuits appropriate to their station. In response to the divine labour crisis, Marduk demonstrated a new and essential facet of his sovereignty, not as a warrior or creator of cosmic structures, but as a shrewd and innovative administrator. He convened the divine assembly once more, not to seek their counsel in a moment of weakness, but to present a fully formed policy initiative, a definitive solution to the problem of their burdensome toil. This was the act of a true monarch, addressing the legitimate grievances of his subjects with a plan designed to ensure the long-term stability and prosperity of his kingdom. He presented his plan not as a mere suggestion, but as a wise device, a product of the superior intellect that was his paternal inheritance. The plan was the creation of an entirely new class of being, a mortal labourer who would exist for the sole purpose of serving the divine state. The core of his proposal was to fashion a being who would bear the corvée of the gods. The term used, dulu, is the same Akkadian word used for the compulsory state labour that was a fundamental part of Mesopotamian society. By using this specific terminology, the Enuma Elish was creating a divine precedent for a terrestrial institution. The hard, repetitive, and essential work of maintaining the infrastructure of civilization, digging canals, building temples, harvesting crops, was to be mirrored in the cosmic order. This new being, which Marduk proposed to call Lulu Amelu, or primitive man, would be a cosmic proletariat, a workforce designed to relieve the divine aristocracy of their physical burdens. This would secure their ease, allowing them to exist in a state of dignified leisure appropriate to their status. However, the function of this new creation was not merely to perform labour. Marduk's plan was twofold and ingeniously self-sustaining. In addition to taking on the physical work of cosmic maintenance, humanity would also be tasked with the sacred duty of providing for the gods through worship and sacrifice. The construction of temples, the performance of rituals, and the offering of food and drink were to be the primary responsibilities of this new servitor race. This established the fundamental basis of the Mesopotamian religious contract. Humanity works for the gods, and in return, the gods maintain the cosmic order that makes human life possible. This plan was therefore a perfect solution. It solved the immediate labour dispute, while simultaneously creating a perpetual source of honour, reverence, and sustenance for the entire pantheon. It was a masterful piece of political and economic engineering, a proposal that promised to secure the ease of the gods and the eternal worship of their names in a single creative act. Marduk's ingenious plan for a servitor race required a specific and potent raw material. The creation of a being capable of understanding and carrying out divine commands necessitated a divine component. Mere clay would not suffice. To solve this material problem, Marduk presented the divine assembly with a legal and theological masterstroke. He declared that one of the captive gods, a member of the defeated rebel army, must be sacrificed to provide the necessary divine essence. This was not a call for a random act of violence, but the initiation of a formal legal proceeding. The creation of humanity was to be predicated upon a judicial execution, an act that would at once punish the guilty and provide the foundation for a new order. This established a worldview in which the very existence of humankind is inextricably linked to an act of divine judgment and retribution. The defendant in this cosmic trial was immediately identified by Marduk Kingu. This was a calculated political decision. By singling out the rebel general, Marduk was not just choosing a convenient victim. He was formally assigning culpability for the entire cosmic war. He accused Kingu of being the one who contrived the uprising and made Tiamat rebel. This legal charge, whether entirely accurate or not, served to retroactively justify the war and consolidate all blame onto a single defeated figure. The Divine Assembly, acting as a court, readily accepted the charge. Kingu was bound, tried, and convicted of treason against the newly established divine state. His sentence was death, a verdict that was both a political necessity and a creative prerequisite. He was to be the ultimate scapegoat, his death serving as the final bloody punctuation mark on the failed rebellion. The method of his execution was precise and purposeful. His arteries were severed, and from his blood, humanity was to be fashioned. This is the most critical element of the Mesopotamian anthropology presented in the Enuma Elish. Human beings are not created from the substance of a benevolent creator god, but from the blood of a convicted traitor. This explains the inherent duality of the human condition in the Babylonian worldview. The divine blood of Kingu is what gives humanity its intelligence, its capacity for civilization, and its ability to serve the gods. However, it is also the source of its flaws, a rebellious spirit, a tendency toward chaos, and an inclination to disrupt the divine order. Humankind is therefore created with a built-in contradiction, a divine spark that is intrinsically tainted by its origin in treason. The sacrifice of Kingu was the perfect, brutal solution. It purged the cosmos of its primary traitor, while simultaneously providing the flawed, divine material necessary to create a workforce capable of understanding its duties, yet forever bound to its servile and troubled nature. The execution of the divine sentence was carried out with the solemn precision of a state ritual. The task of fashioning the first human beings was delegated by Marduk the sovereign to his father, Ea, the divine artisan. This delegation was a critical detail in the new cosmic administration, establishing a clear separation between the executive who decrees and the minister who implements. Marduk, as the king, conceived the plan and passed the sentence, but it was Ea, in his traditional role as the god of craftsmanship and wisdom, who possessed the technical skill to bring the complex creation into being. At the new monarch's direction, Ea severed Kingu's arteries, allowing the traitor god's blood to flow, providing the essential divine component for the new creation. This was not a frenzied act of violence, but a controlled and purposeful procedure, the first step in a sacred manufacturing process. The creation of humanity was a composite act, a mingling of two distinct substances, the divine blood of Kingu and the mundane clay of the earth. This combination is a central tenet of Mesopotamian anthropology, appearing in other creation accounts like the Atrahasis epic. The clay, or Taitu, was the physical medium, the substance of the terrestrial world that would give humanity its physical form and its mortality. It was what bound humans to the earth and made them subject to its limitations. The blood, however, was the animating principle. It was the Itemu, the spirit or divine spark, that elevated this new being above the beasts of the field. It was the source of humanity's intelligence, its capacity for language, its ability to understand divine commands, and, most importantly, its ability to perform the complex labor of maintaining the cosmos. Ea, as the divine potter, mixed this potent combination of traitor's blood and earthly clay, and fashioned the first human beings. The act is described as a craft, reinforcing the Babylonian view of humanity as a manufactured product with a specific utilitarian purpose. Humans were not an afterthought or an accident. They were a deliberately engineered solution to a divine labor problem. Their very substance was a paradox. They were terrestrial and mortal, yet animated by a divine immortal spirit. They were intelligent and capable, yet their intelligence was derived from a being convicted of treason. This established the fundamental, tragic, and noble contradiction of the human condition in the Mesopotamian worldview. To be a creature of the earth, forever bound to toil and mortality, yet to carry within oneself a spark of the divine, a troubled legacy that is at once the source of humanity's greatest achievements and its most profound failings. With the cosmic order established and the problem of divine labor definitively solved, the narrative of the Enuma Elish moves to its final and most important political act, the founding of a terrestrial capital for the new cosmic monarch. This was not an initiative undertaken by Marduk himself, but an act of collective gratitude and fealty by the divine assembly. The gods, now freed from their burdensome toil by the creation of humanity, proposed to build a great city for their savior and king. This act was the ultimate expression of their submission and loyalty, a tangible and permanent tribute to the sovereign who had guaranteed their security and ease. The construction of a capital city by the subjects for their ruler was a powerful political statement, a mythological reflection of the way terrestrial kings in Mesopotamia would commission great works to honor their patron deities and solidify their own legacy. The city they chose to build was Babylon, a name that in Akkadian, Bab-Ili, means gateway of the gods. This etymology is the theological and political heart of the entire epic. The city was to be no mere earthly dwelling, but the official and functional nexus between the divine and terrestrial realms. It was conceived as the cosmic intersection, the one place on earth where the gods could descend from their celestial stations to assemble and interact with the world. This made Babylon not just a city, but the administrative center of the universe on earth, the physical counterpart to the divine assembly in the heavens. For a Babylonian audience, this was an irrefutable argument for their city's unique and preeminent status among all other cities in the world. It was not just a center of political or economic power, it was the divinely ordained center of reality itself. The construction was undertaken by the gods themselves, a final celebratory act of collective labor before they handed over the burden of work to humanity. The text describes them spending a full year molding the bricks, a sacred act of craftsmanship that mirrored Marduk's own creation of the cosmos. This divine construction project served to imbue the physical city of Babylon with an unparalleled sanctity. Its walls, temples, and streets were not built by mortal hands, but by the very beings who governed the universe. This mythological charter was the ultimate piece of political propaganda, a divine sanction for Babylon's historical rise to imperial power. The city's supremacy was not a matter of military conquest or historical accident. It was a foundational fact of the cosmos, a city built by the gods for their king, destined from the moment of creation to be the eternal gateway between heaven and earth. The divine construction of Babylon culminated in its most essential feature, the creation of a great temple complex at the city's heart, the Esagila. This was not merely a place of worship, but the functional terrestrial palace of the cosmic monarch, Marduk's primary dwelling on earth. The name itself, Esagila, is Sumerian for house whose top is lofty, a direct statement of its supreme status and its aspiration to connect with the celestial realms. In the political theology of Mesopotamia, the temple was the administrative center of the god's earthly estate, the point from which the divine ruler managed his affairs. The construction of the Esagila by the gods was therefore the establishment of the central office of the new cosmic government on the terrestrial plane, the place where the divine will would be communicated and enacted. Integral to this temple complex was its ziggurat, a great stepped tower that reached toward the heavens. This structure, later known historically as Etemenanki, House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, was the physical manifestation of Babylon's role as the gateway of the gods. It was a man-made mountain, an architectural axis mundi designed to provide a literal stairway between the divine and human worlds. It was upon this ziggurat that the gods could descend from their celestial dwellings to the assembly in Babylon, and it was here that the rituals that maintained the cosmic order were performed. The construction of this specific architectural feature by the divine assembly was a mythological validation of the actual ziggurat of Babylon, imbuing that physical structure with a unique and unparalleled sacred function. It was not just a temple, it was a foundational component of the cosmic machinery. The establishment of the Esagila as Marduk's primary residence served to centralize all religious and political authority in a single physical location. It became the ultimate court of appeal, the supreme sanctuary, and the final repository of divine knowledge. For the Babylonian state, this myth provided an unshakable charter for their capital's religious supremacy. The Esagila was not just the most important temple in their empire, it was the divinely constructed, official residence of the king of the universe. All other temples and all other gods were, by definition, subordinate to the authority that emanated from this sacred precinct. The building of the temple was the final act of cosmic organization, a move that gave the new ordered universe a physical address, a terrestrial anchor point from which the divine monarch would rule his creation for all time. The epic concludes not with a narrative event, but with a lengthy and profound theological document: the bestowal of the 50 sacred names upon Marduk. This final section of the Enuma Elish is the ultimate act of fealty by the divine assembly, a formal and ritualized confirmation of Marduk's eternal reign. In Mesopotamian thought, a name was not a mere label but the very essence of a thing's being and function. To know a being's true name was to understand its nature and to have a measure of power over it. For the gods to collectively bestow 50 such names upon their new king was therefore not an honorific ceremony, it was the most solemn and legally binding act of constitutional definition. This was the final ratification of the new cosmic order, a detailed enumeration of the new monarch's powers, responsibilities, and very nature. This long hymnic passage is a masterpiece of Babylonian theological scholarship. Each of the 50 names is presented with an explanation of its meaning, functioning as a specific article in the new cosmic charter. These are not just praise names. They are a systematic transfer of the functions and attributes of the entire pantheon into the person of Marduk. For example, names like Asaluhi grant him the magical powers of his father, Ea, while others connect him to the authority of the great god, Enlil, effectively making him the new Lord of the Wind. Through this process of onomastic syncretism, Marduk is shown to subsume the roles of all the other major deities. He is not just their king, he is the embodiment of their collective powers. This theological mechanism served a clear political purpose: to elevate Babylon's patron deity above all others, and to justify the city's imperial claim to be the center of the universe. The bestowing of these names was a collective oath of allegiance by the divine assembly. By defining his powers, they were also defining and limiting their own. Each name they gave him was a function they were ceding. This final act solidified his reign, grounding it not just in the raw power of his military victory, but in a detailed and legally recognized divine right. His authority was now multifaceted, precisely defined, and unanimously acclaimed. The 50 names were the final and most sacred text of the new cosmic state, a coronation hymn that was also a constitutional document, ensuring that Marduk's rule was not an arbitrary dictatorship, but a legitimate monarchy whose every function was known, named, and eternally sanctioned by the divine will.